right, Francis, let's talk about the Coquille Indian Tribe's previous forest management practices. And then in addition to that, I understand that they're going for a special certification, and your group and others have challenged that certification for a couple of reasons. One of which is that it's really more for private forests rather than public forests. I understand. Maybe you can explain more on that too. So let's begin with how the Coquille Tribe has harvested timber in the past.
The Coquille Tribe was given 5,400 acres of Coos Bay BLM land back in around 1997, 98. And so it was an act of Congress that decided to give them land to manage. And this land had just been put under the Northwest Forest Plan, the BLM and the Forest Service, to mitigate all the past heavy clear cutting that they had done in the 1980s. Putting all the critters of the forest in danger. They now have to manage under the Northwest Forest Plan starting in 1995. And the Northwest Forest Plan put aside some of the forests into riparian reserves that run along streams, and some into reserves for old growth dependent species that were blocks of land that were reserved, and some of it was in matrix that they could log. Unfortunately, most of the land that was set aside in reserves, or at least half of it, had already been clear cut and were plantations. And a lot of the forests that were in matrix, what they could log, was old growth. So there was some problems with that Northwest Forest Plan. But soon after the Northwest Forest Plan went into effect for Coos Bay BLM, the federal government transferred 5,400 acres of that over to the tribe, saying that the tribe had to manage it according to the land management practices of Coos Bay BLM, of the adjoining landowner, which was the Northwest Forest Plan. So the tribe really had to manage this according to the Northwest Forest Plan, and that plan required that before any of this old growth was clear cut, or at least they don't use the word clear cut, they use regeneration harvest, because they leave about 6 trees per acre. So before they could clear cut this land, they had a survey for rare species. And if they found any rare species, they had to set aside a little circle of that land. The Coquille Tribe put out a forest management plan for their 5,000 acres and said, well, we think we could probably log about 2 million board feet a year. We thought that this was reasonable for 5,000 acres. So we were very disappointed when their very first timber sale was for 10 million board feet. And we were disappointed when we found them clear cutting it. Actually, they hired their cohorts Lone Rock Timber to clear cut it. We found that they were clear cutting it without doing the surveys for rare species. And so we went to our lawyers and got an injunction and stopped them from working until they did those surveys. It was just before New Year's Eve. And we did a hike on New Year's Day to go look at these lands, which were supposed to be open for the public, just like BLM lands were. And we were very disappointed to see that over this long holiday weekend, the loggers were there, felling trees as fast as they could, in defiance of this court injunction to stop logging. And we couldn't get another injunction until the court was back in session on Tuesday after this long injunction. And they were really mad that they had broken, that they were logging illegally. They fined them big money that went to restoration projects below them. So that was our introduction to the management of the lands by the Coquille Tribe. Later, the Coquille Tribe decided that, they didn't want to manage these lands according to the Northwest Forest Plan, that didn't allow them to clear cut, even though they got only matrix lands, and the only reserves they had to leave was the stream buffers along the streams the buffers around the rare species that they would find.
Could you explain what matrix lands is?
Those were the lands under the Northwest Forest Plan that were not reserved.
Okay.
For wildlife. They were not either riparian, they were not stream buffers, and they weren't these big blocks that were set aside for old growth species.
Okay.
They were the lands that they could log. And they did not want to manage according to the Northwest Forest Plan. They want to manage according to the Oregon Forest Practices Act, which allows far more clear cutting, far more destruction. It requires no stream buffers on smaller streams. And so they propose that the BLM change their management on all lands that adjoin the Coquille Tribe lands. It's called the Tribal Cooperative Management Area. So this was back in, it was about 5 years ago that they proposed the TCMA, the Tribal Cooperative Management Area, where they would cooperatively manage with BLM the lands next to the tribal lands. And since the act of Congress that gave them these lands said that they had to manage according to BLM lands adjacent to them, they thought, well, if we can't clear cut more, maybe we get the BLM to clear cut more, and therefore we can clear cut more. And so they proposed the Tribal Cooperative Management Area. They have glossy brochures on it and everything. And it proposed that they cooperatively manage the land with BLM. It would be about 23,000 acres, because if you take every section that touches the 5,000 acres, plus the 5,000 acres, it came out to about 23,000 acres, that they manage it with greatly reduced stream buffers. Instead of leaving 6 trees per acre, they leave no trees per acre. And so they could much more harshly log this land. And that Tribal Cooperative Management Area was part of the Western Oregon Plan revisions when BLM was thinking about changing their plan. So that did not happen. The Congress did not accept that. The Department of Interior did not accept that. And so they're back to managing under the Northwest Forest Plan. And so we're disappointed to see that their interpretation of the Northwest Forest Plan is a little different than BLM's. For instance, recently there's a new recovery plan out for the Northwest, for the Northern Spotted Owl, and from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, in charge of protecting not only the marble murrelets and the spotted owl, all terrestrial species that are protected under the Endangered Species Act. And the National Marine Fisheries Service is protecting coho salmon that run on these rivers through these forest lands. So so they were clear cutting more of their lands, and this land contained potential spotted owls because it was old growth forest. We went up and looked at it. We found some trees that were cut down that could have been up to 400 years old, and really a beautiful old growth forest. Now, BLM would not have clear cut this high quality spotted owl habitat due to the spotted owl recovery plan. There's something in the Spotted Owl Recovery Plan called Recovery Action 32, which says if it's really high quality spotted owl habitat, hold off before you clear cut it, even if it's in the matrix, because the spotted owl is really, taking a nosedive. And so the BLM would not have clear cut this, but the tribe wrote to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and said, hey, we're a tribe, not a federal agency, and therefore we feel as though we don't have to comply with the recovery plan for the spotted owl. And they clear cut it. It's gone now, or they're just finished clear cutting it. And so even though the BLM never would have done this, BLM would have adhered to the recovery plan for the spotted owl. The tribe said, we are not a federal agency, we are a tribe, and we are our own sovereign nation, and we don't have to follow this recovery plan. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife wrote back and said, well, probably killed at least one owl. They called it take. There was a take of at least one owl. So this is the tribe's management currently, and it's not as good as BLM's. BLM would be far more protective of wildlife. And the reason why this is important is because the BLM land, the public land, is the only place in our Coast Range where wildlife can live. They certainly can't live on industrial timberland, and you can't expect, you can't force, Weyerhaeuser to lose money and protect endangered species like coho that swim through their lands. We should be able to protect coho that swim through their lands or birds that fly through their lands. If this was the state of California or the state of Washington, we would be able to protect those species that go through their lands that are more of a public resources. But here in Oregon, we have a very weak Oregon Forest Practices Act, and so we can't protect those species. And so that's why the BLM land is more important than ever. It's the only place where wildlife can have a safe home. And even on BLM land, you're allowed to do clear cutting, and they call it regeneration harvest. But there's some places that are set aside for this wildlife. So that's why the BLM land is so important, and that's why it was so important for the tribe to continue to log under the same rules that the BLM did. Since this had been BLM land, it was the Northwest Forest Plan is a regional strategy that goes from the Northwest Forest Plan itself is a very intricate, integrated regional strategy for the spotted owl. And if you interrupt one little part of that plan, it really plays havoc with the whole plan.
Now, the tribe is representing that it is getting this certification. I believe it's FSC, which is the forest. I should have that in front of me, but I don't. I think
Forest, Stewardship Council.
Yeah, Forest Stewardship Council, and Cascadia Wildlands and the large company or large grouper and others have objected or challenged this certification because no environmental groups were actually brought in as stakeholders in this process. And I believe the last time I asked you, you mentioned that you have not received any word back from FSC in this regard. But could you explain a little bit about what that certification is? Does that mean that the tribe, in order to maintain that certification, has to be better?
No, the tribe is not supposed to be logging old growth in that certification, and they aren't supposed to be degrading endangered species habitat in that certification. And so we believe that number one, the certification is weaker than the Northwest Forest Plan, has stronger regulations than the certification. Certification does allow massive herbicide spraying and clear cutting and such. But nonetheless, we don't believe that it complies with at least the additional acres timber sales. The name of it was called additional acres. And that's the one where the tribe wrote to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and says, we are not going to protect spotted owls here. We know that they likely live here, and it's high-quality habitat. We know the recovery plan says don't log here, but we're going to log it anyway because we're a tribe and we aren't a federal government. We can do whatever we want. Probably, I would think the FSC certification would not have allowed the logging of old-growth forests to the extent that they did. So, what the tribe is telling the certifiers, is anyone's guess, and we are not involved in that because they have to name stakeholders, and of course we are not stakeholder. They didn't name any environmental group as a stakeholder. They did name a Portland environmental group that has never had any familiarity with their practices as a stakeholder group, but nobody local, nobody who really reads their documents. We have been reading their documents for years and providing comments. They do allow public comments, and we've been providing that. And but we were not named as a stakeholder. So we have complained to the FSC people. We still haven't heard anything back from that.
Okay.
You expect to hear back from them, though.
Okay.